They laughed when he pulled 2 crumpled dollar bills from his pocket, mocked him, called him a fool for wasting money on a girl no one else wanted. She was broken, scarred, and silent, sitting with her head bowed so low it looked as if she wanted to disappear. But that cowboy, that struggling cowboy who had almost nothing left to his name, he saw something in her that no one else cared to look for. And what he found in her, well, what he found changed everything. This is not just a story about a man rescuing a girl. It's a story about how sometimes, the thing we think is too broken to love becomes the very hope we were searching for all along. The air was thick with dust and the sound of boots scuffing against the dry ground as folks gathered in the town square. Men leaned against posts with their arms crossed, women whispered behind fans, and children peeked curiously from behind skirts. The wooden platform creaked under the weight of those brought up to be sold, not cattle, not horses, but girls. Each one stood stiff as the auctioneer barked out their worth in dollars, each one trying to hide the tremble in their legs as strangers looked them over like they were livestock. Elias Boone stood near the back of the crowd, his hat pulled low to keep the sun out of his tired eyes. He hadn't come to buy anyone, not with the state his life was in. His ranch was hanging on by threads, his herd nearly gone, and his pockets near empty. Some days he couldn't even remember the taste of a full meal. He'd worked his land with bleeding hands, fought the drought that burned everything in its path, and each morning he woke up wondering if it was worth one more fight. He came today not out of want but out of something else, something like punishment, as though seeing the misery of others reminded him he wasn't the only one whose world had come apart. The auctioneer rattled off numbers, his booming voice bouncing against the buildings. A blonde girl with bright eyes fetched $10. A sturdy one with broad shoulders brought $6. Elias didn't move, didn't raise his head. He wasn't here to spend money he didn't have. He had only 2 wrinkled bills shoved in his pocket, set aside for flour and maybe coffee, if he stretched it right. That money was his survival. Then came the next one. The girl was small, shoulders hunched so tight she looked as though she was trying to disappear inside herself. Her hair was tangled, dull under the sun, and the dress she wore hung limp and threadbare, too big for her thin frame. She didn't look up. She kept her chin tucked against her chest, her hands gripping the sides of her skirt so hard her knuckles were white. She was young, but something about the way she stood, still, resigned, lifeless, made her look older than the years she carried. Lot number 7, the auctioneer bellowed. A fine young girl, who'll start the bidding at $5. The crowd went still. No one moved. A cough broke the silence. Someone spat into the dirt. The auctioneer's voice tightened. $3 then, surely 3. Nothing. 2. He tried, irritation breaking through his smile. A chuckle rippled through the men standing closest. One called out, wouldn't give 2 pennies for her. Another barked laughter, adding, you'd pay 2 just to keep her away from you. The girl flinched at the words, but only slightly, as though she'd grown used to being spoken about that way. She didn't look at them. She didn't beg. She just stood there, a shadow in the hot light of day. Elias felt something twist in his chest. He knew that look, the kind that said you'd already been convinced you were worth nothing. He'd seen it in his own reflection when the bank laughed at him, when neighbors turned their backs, when he lay in his bunkhouse, staring at the ceiling wondering if he'd lost it all. His hand brushed his pocket. $2. That was all. It was foolish. Foolish beyond measure. $2 could mean bread, coffee, maybe enough beans to fill his belly for another week. But his voice rose before he had the chance to stop it. 2. The word cut through the silence like a whip. Heads turned. A wave of laughter followed. The fool cowboy, someone shouted, ain't got 2 cents to his name, but he's buying scraps now. Another hollered, he don't even feed himself proper, what's he gonna do with her? Elias ignored them, his jaw set firm, his eyes steady. The auctioneer slammed the gavel. Sold. Lot 7 goes for $2. They shoved the girl off the platform toward him, and she stumbled as her feet hit the dirt. She didn't look at him, didn't offer a word. She just clutched her arms tight around herself, shaking like a leaf in the wind. Elias crouched a little, careful not to crowd her, his voice low so the crowd couldn't hear. You got a name. Her lips moved, but no sound came. He leaned in just enough to catch the whisper. Clara. The name struck him. Not. Lot 7. Not a bargain. Clara. A person. He straightened and guided her toward his horse. The crowd's laughter trailed after them like buzzing flies, but he kept his shoulders square. Let them laugh. Let them sneer. He knew what he'd done. Maybe it was reckless, maybe it was downright foolish, but it felt like the first right thing he'd done in a long time. At the horse, he offered his hand, but Clara hesitated. Her wide, shadowed eyes darted between him and the saddle like she expected some kind of trick. "It's all right," Elias said softly. "Ain't no harm waiting for you on the other side." His voice was steady, patient, the way he might speak to a spooked colt. She let him help her up, moving stiffly, every muscle taut. Elias climbed up behind her, and together they rode out of town. He felt the weight of her silence, heavy as the sun on his back, but he didn't press her with words. Sometimes silence was safer than speech. He knew that too well. When they reached his ranch, Clara didn't move to step inside the small wooden house. She hovered on the porch like she wasn't sure she was allowed, her bare feet hesitant on the boards. Elias lit a lantern, the warm glow spilling through the doorway, and leaned against the frame. "You can come in," he said gently. "You're not a burden here." Her head lifted just enough for their eyes to meet, and in that glance Elias saw it, the fear, the shame, but also something else. A spark so faint it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. Hope, buried deep. She stepped inside, and Elias felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. For months he had lived with emptiness, with failure clinging to his shoulders like a second skin. But now, in the dim light of his worn-out home, standing across from the girl no one wanted, he realized he'd found something unexpected. Maybe not salvation, maybe not fortune, but something that mattered more than $2 wrinkled in his pocket. And he knew, without speaking it aloud, that life had just changed, for both of them. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. Elias was used to silence. His ranch had been lonely for months, the kind of lonely that eats away at you when the walls creak and there's no one to answer back. But the silence Clara carried was different. It wasn't just the absence of words, it was the weight of someone who had learned that speaking only brought pain. She moved like a shadow across the small house, never asking for anything, never making a sound unless she absolutely had to. Elias tried not to crowd her. He went about his work as usual, mending fences, hauling water, checking the thin soil for any sign of growth. He knew enough about wounds to recognize one when he saw it, and Clara was covered in the kind no eye could see. He didn't press, he simply let her be. If she wanted to sit on the porch and stare out at the dying horizon, he let her. If she chose to sweep the dusty floor or patch a torn shirt without a word, he let her. At night, when the cicadas sang in the darkness, he could sometimes hear her breathing through the thin wall that separated her small room from his. Shallow, uneven, like someone who slept with one foot still ready to run. He'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what she saw when her eyes closed. One evening, after a long day spent dragging water to his shriveled garden, Elias poured himself a cup of bitter coffee, so thin it was little more than colored water, and without thinking, poured a second cup. He carried it outside where Clara sat on the porch with her knees drawn close, her eyes fixed on the red sky as the sun bled into the earth. He set the cup beside her. "Ain't much," he said, "but it's warm." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she wrapped her hands around the tin cup and lifted it to her lips. Her face scrunched at the taste, and then, so soft Elias almost missed it, he heard a laugh. A quiet, startled sound, like she'd forgotten how it felt to make it. Elias blinked, surprised. "What's funny?" She shook her head, the faintest smile tugging at her mouth. "It's bitter, but warm." It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Elias, who hadn't heard laughter in his home for longer than he could remember, it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The next days brought small changes. Clara still moved carefully, but she began to hum sometimes when she worked. She mended his shirts without asking, patched his saddle where the leather had worn thin. She cleared weeds from the edge of the yard and turned the soil with bare hands, planting seeds Elias hadn't bothered to hope would grow. Elias noticed, though he never made a fuss. He'd watch her from the barn door, her hair falling across her face as she bent over the earth, her hands steady and sure. She didn't speak much, but every day she seemed a little less like a ghost, a little more like someone who wanted to belong. One evening, while Elias was oiling his boots, Clara sat across the room mending a torn shirt. Out of nowhere, she spoke. "They said I wasn't worth feeding." Her voice was flat, like she was repeating a fact she'd heard too many times. Elias froze, his boot half-laced. "Who said that?" "My family." Her fingers tightened around the needle. "They said I cost too much." That I was just another mouth. So they sold me. She swallowed hard. And no one wanted me. Elias leaned forward, his voice rough but steady. Listen to me. You're not what they said you are. You're not the price someone set on you. He let the words hang heavy in the air. You're more than what you've been through. Her eyes lifted, searching his face, almost as if she wanted to believe him but didn't know how. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she bent her head back to the fabric, but Elias could swear her stitches came faster, sharper, as though she was sewing her hurt into the seams. Weeks passed. The land stayed dry, and Elias' worry grew heavier. The garden Clara had planted sprouted small green shoots, fragile but alive. She tended them carefully, shading them with bits of cloth to keep the sun from burning them out. Elias began to see her patience, her determination. It reminded him of himself, of every day he had refused to let the ranch die, even when it felt like the whole world had given up on him. One night, when the stars burned bright above them, Elias sat on the porch with his elbows resting on his knees. His voice was quiet when he said it, but he meant every word. I don't know how much longer I can hold on here. The land's near spent, the bank's breathing down my neck. Some days I think it'd be easier to walk away. Clara didn't look at him right away. She traced the rim of the coffee cup in her hands, thoughtful. Then she spoke, her voice soft but strong. Then don't hold on alone. You saved me when no one else would. Let me help save you. Elias turned his head slowly, his eyes locking on hers. She meant it. He could see it plain as day. And she did help. The vegetables she planted took root and began to thrive, bringing fresh food to their table when his cupboards were bare. She mended clothes not just for Elias, but for neighbors who came by when they noticed her skill. A few coins here, some flour there, it wasn't much, but it kept them afloat. The more Clara worked, the more she came alive. She laughed more freely, she spoke her mind. She even teased Elias once when his horse nipped his hat off his head, and Elias, startled, had laughed so hard he nearly doubled over. It felt like the ranch, once filled with emptiness, was breathing again. But the weight of struggle still lingered. Elias carried it in his shoulders, in the way he sometimes stared at the horizon too long. One evening, Clara reached across the table and laid her hand on his. Her touch was light, but it steadied him. We'll get through it, she said simply. And he believed her. Months later, when the long-awaited rains finally came, they stood together in the yard as water poured from the sky. The dry earth drank greedily, the garden soaking in every drop. Clara tilted her face up, laughing as the rain plastered her hair against her cheeks. Elias couldn't help but stare at her, joy radiating from her as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. You know, he said, his voice thick, I thought I was buying someone for $2 that day. Clara turned, her eyes shining brighter than the rain. And what did you really get? Elias stepped closer, taking her hand in his, rough fingers folding over hers. Hope, he whispered. I bought hope. The words caught in his throat, but he didn't need to say more. Because standing there, with the rain washing away the dust of yesterday, Elias knew the truth. He hadn't just rescued her. She had rescued him too.